Can this alternate history map of Australia teach us anything about alternate cartography? Well, let's take a trip down under and find out. Hello everyone, I'm Matt Mitrovich, the alternate historian, and I have a patron-requested map analysis to share with you all today. This map is titled Australia Alt History Map circa 1880, which just rolls right off the tongue, and it was published in 2012 by White Tower EXE, an Australian who created this map for a contest to see who could create the best alternate history map of Australia over at the Map and Flags DeviantArt group. Unfortunately, I couldn't figure out if this map ultimately won the contest, and White Tower never responded to my attempts to get in touch, but if you were active on Maps and Flags in 2012, please let us know who won in the comments. But for now, let's take a closer look at the map. Artistically speaking, it's not bad, and it's certainly better than anything I could have done. I like the minimalist style, and looks as if it might appear in a kid's alternate history textbook. If I have any major issues with the map, though, it's with the alternate history behind it. Now, please take what I'm about to say regarding Australian history with a grain of salt. I don't know much about it outside what I hear from the Weekly Planet podcast, and I struggled to find any concise, easy-to-digest history book on Australia before tackling this map, but I ran out of time and had to rely on internet sources. That said, I still learned a lot of interesting things about early Australian history, but that was cool. In this alternate history, Australia is Balkanized between 6 different states. The first is the Commonwealth of Australia, which was settled by the British after they landed in New South Wales in 1788, motivated in part to set up a new penal colony after those pesky Americans decided they were too good to live under the Union Jack. The point of divergence comes with the establishment of the Southern Colony, or French Australia. In our timeline, and I'm sorry if I butchered the pronunciation, Jean-François de Galou, Comte de la Perouse, a French explorer, arrived shortly after the British colonists did. He stayed for a little while before leaving to explore the South Pacific, where he and his crew ultimately disappeared. In this alternate timeline, de la Perouse instead sails north and establishes a colony in what is today Queensland. Frankly, I'm not sure if this POD is plausible, given that the French expedition was mostly a voyage of discovery rather than colonization. Per my research, future French colonies in the Pacific were planned, but these were long-term goals. Plus, shortly after La Perouse disappeared, the French Revolution began, meaning that France would, to put it mildly, be too distracted to properly colonize Australia, and any colonies established would likely just be seized by the British. So for the southern colonies to survive, you would need to either delay or avoid the French Revolution, which would cause a huge amount of changes to history, which is not something I think White Tower intended with this map. Next on our tour is New Holland and the Dutch East Indies Trading Company territory. In our timeline, the Dutch were the first Europeans to sight Australia in 1606, and they named the continent New Holland, which is what they also named their short-lived 17th century colony Brazil, suggesting the Dutch aren't that original at naming colonies. Anywho, despite exploring the coast of Australia extensively, they made no move to settle it because they found Australia to be inhospitable, and so moved on to the easier climate of Indonesia. But in the alternate timeline for this map, the Dutch for some reason get interested again in New Holland. They grab parts of Western Australia and Tasmania, and the British are oddly okay with it. Workers are shipped in from the Dutch East Indies, which probably gave the lands a Dutch Indonesia culture. The map description says the northern section is governed by one of the first nega corporations, the Dutch East India Company, called the Dutch East Indies Trading Company on the map, while the southern portions are governed by the Dutch Crown, but when that company dissolves in 1799, their territory in the north apparently gets independence. But how? In our timeline, the company's territories became Dutch government colonies, so why didn't this happen in this alternate timeline? Plus, the map itself doesn't even show the territory as independent, but rather still being company territory in 1880. On top of that, why wouldn't the British just take these territories like they took the Cape County from the Dutch in our timeline during the French Revolution and Napoleonic Wars? Also, why wasn't this flag for the Dutch East Indies territory included on the map? It would look a lot better than just the symbol of the company the map has now. From Dutch Australia, we move on to the Aboriginal Free State, which straddles most of our timeline's northern territory, and honestly could have used a better name. I mean, I like the idea of an independent state for Indigenous Australians, as their history with their colonizers seemed just as bad as it was for Native Americans, but unfortunately my lack of knowledge on them means I can't really comment on whether this is plausible. My research did find that in the past, micronations have been declared by Indigenous Australians, like the Maori Republic and the Sovereign Yidindiji government, and I again apologize if I mispronounce those, but these haven't been recognized by anyone. Finally, we round out our look at this map with the Republic of Australia. According to the description, the 1850s Australian gold rush still happens, as does the Eureka Rebellion, which in our timeline was a short-lived rebellion by angry Australian miners who were upset about many things, including taxation without representation. The British will never learn. In this alternate timeline, the rebellion is much more successful, perhaps because the British were distracted elsewhere and the local government didn't try to mollify the pro-rebel populace by extending the vote to all male citizens, as they did in our timeline. But this is just speculation, because there is little to no explanation as to why this tiny rebellion leads to an independent Republic of Australia, taking Victoria, South Australia, whatever parts of Western Australia the Dutch did not want. I think I made my point on how plausible I find this map. So why do the analysis in the first place? Well, first, because a patron requested it. And second, because on the alternatehistory.com wiki article for Australia, the members there bemoan about how often Australia is explored and colonized by the same nations in so many alternate histories. Besides Britain, other colonial powers who bite off a piece of Australia usually include France and the Netherlands, two powers who also had a hand in dividing up White Tower's version of Australia. Now, there isn't anything wrong with that in its face. Both France and the Netherlands did show interest in Australia in our timeline, but then again, so did the Spanish and Portuguese, who were exploring the area at the same time the other Europeans were, and had colonies nearby. Personally, it could make for a more interesting scenario to have them claim parts of Australia, rather than just having the Dutch and French fight the British over it again. Additionally, the wiki article also complained about alternate history maps of Australia having random borders which don't take into account the actual climate of Australia, which does include a lot of arid land that can't support large populations. That said, to my amateur eye, it does look like the borders of this Balkanized Australia correspond roughly with the more habitable and more populated parts of our timeline's Australia, so White Tower gets points for that. But then again, when else am I going to get a chance to talk about a problem a lot of maps face? Randomness. It happens when creators want the map to look a certain way, even if it doesn't make sense from a historical or geographical perspective. It's a problem that all alternate cartographers have to take into account and can usually be solved by good research. Otherwise, they may make a map that they think looks cool, but others will ignore. And as for White Tower's Australia alt history map circa 1880, it's not bad, but its divisions of Australia are cliché and don't always make historical sense. There are good ideas here, and White Tower does take into account Australia's geography when designing the nations of this alternate Australia, so I don't want to be too hard in its creation, but the overall scenario could use some work. Well, that's all to say on the subject. If you like what I do, please comment, subscribe, share this video, support me on Patreon. I'm Matt Mitrovic, the Alternate Historian. Bye.